The afternoon sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting gentle patterns across the maternity ward floor. Sarah Beth Collins adjusted her position in the narrow bed, cradling 3-day-old Emma against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Sarah's thumb, and she marveled at the perfect miniature fingernails, each one no bigger than a grain of rice. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, brushing a kiss across Emma's downy head. "Absolutely perfect." Bobby Mitchell stood by the window, his shoulders rigid as he stared out at the parking lot below. His reflection in the glass looked tired, older than his 28 years. When Sarah had suggested he hold Emma earlier, he'd mumbled something about needing to make phone calls and retreated to the corner chair. "Bobby?" Sarah's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Don't you want to hold her? She's your daughter too." He turned, running a hand through his brown hair. "I just need some fresh air, you know? This place is suffocating." His eyes darted everywhere except toward the baby. Nurse Patricia Williams knocked and entered, her comfortable smile warming the room. "How are we doing in here? Ready for another feeding lesson?" "I think I'm getting the hang of it," Sarah said, though her confidence wavered slightly. Patricia checked Emma's vitals with practiced efficiency. "She's a strong little one. Good weight, healthy color." She glanced at Bobby, then back at Sarah. "Some new fathers need time to adjust." The reality of a baby can be overwhelming. Sarah caught something in the nurse's tone, a gentle warning wrapped in understanding. Before she could respond, Bobby's phone buzzed against the windowsill. He grabbed it quickly, and Sarah watched his face drain of color as he read the screen. "Who is it?" she asked. Bobby's thumb moved swiftly, hiding the display. "Just work stuff." But Sarah had glimpsed the name at the top of the message. Jenny. Her stomach tightened with a familiar knot of unease. The drive home from the hospital should have been magical, their first journey as a family of 3. Instead, silence filled Bobby's truck while Emma slept peacefully in her car seat. Sarah watched the familiar streets of Millbrook pass by. The old courthouse, Miller's grocery, the Methodist church where they'd been married just 14 months ago. Their modest ranch house on Maple Street looked exactly the same, yet everything felt different. Bobby carried the hospital bags while Sarah managed Emma in the car seat, fumbling with keys at the front door. Inside, the living room seemed smaller somehow, as if the addition of one tiny person had shifted the very dimensions of their space. Thomas Mitchell's silver Buick pulled into the driveway just as Sarah settled into the nursery rocker for Emma's first feeding at home. She heard voices in the kitchen, Thomas's booming laugh and Bobby's quieter responses. Through the window, she watched her father-in-law unload grocery bags and a massive teddy bear from his trunk. "There's my granddaughter." Thomas's voice carried down the hallway as his footsteps approached. He appeared in the doorway, his weathered face beaming with pride. At 64, Thomas Mitchell commanded respect throughout Millbrook as the owner of Mitchell's Hardware, the store that had served 3 generations of families. "She's feeding," Sarah said softly, adjusting Emma's position. Thomas lowered his voice to a reverent whisper. "Look at those tiny hands. She's going to be a heartbreaker, just like her mama." He settled into the wooden chair Bobby had assembled weeks ago. "I've already called my lawyer about setting up a college fund. This little princess is going to have every opportunity." Sarah's heart swelled. Thomas had welcomed her into the Mitchell family from their first meeting, treating her with the same fierce loyalty he showed his own son. "That's so generous, Thomas. You don't have to." "Nonsense. She's a Mitchell now, and Mitchells take care of their own." He paused, glancing toward the kitchen. "Where's Bobby gotten to?" "He mentioned needing to handle some business in town." Sarah tried to keep disappointment from her voice. Thomas frowned. "Business? What kind of business can't wait when you've got a 3-day-old daughter at home?" Before Sarah could respond, they heard Bobby's truck start in the driveway. Through the nursery window, she watched him back out onto Maple Street without a backward glance at the house. Thomas stood, his jaw tight. "I'll be right back, sweetheart." Alone with Emma, Sarah felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing against her chest. The baby finished nursing and drifted back to sleep, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling through their small house. Sarah carried her to the crib and stood watching the gentle rise and fall of Emma's breathing, wondering when the joy of new motherhood had become clouded with such uncertainty. In the kitchen, Thomas moved with purposeful efficiency, putting away groceries and organizing baby supplies. He'd always been a man of action, someone who solved problems with practical solutions and unwavering determination. But as he reached for the trash can to dispose of empty bags, something caught his eye. Crumpled among coffee grounds and banana peels was a receipt from Romano's, the nicest restaurant in Millbrook. Thomas smoothed it out, his frown deepening as he read the details. Dinner for two, yesterday evening, while Sarah was still recovering in the hospital. The total was more than Bobby usually spent on groceries for a week. Romano's wasn't the kind of place you went alone, and it certainly wasn't somewhere Bobby would take a business associate. Thomas folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. The next morning, Thomas found Bobby at their usual booth in Mel's Diner on Main Street. The breakfast rush had died down, leaving only a few regulars nursing coffee and reading newspapers. Bobby sat slumped over a plate of untouched eggs, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision. "Morning, son." Thomas slid into the opposite seat, noting the dark circles under Bobby's eyes. "Dad." Bobby's greeting lacked its usual warmth. Dolores Henderson approached with the coffee pot, her gray hair perfectly curled despite the early hour. She'd been serving the Mitchell men their breakfast for over a decade, watching Bobby grow from a gangly teenager into the man sitting across from Thomas now. "The usual, Mr. Mitchell," she asked, filling Thomas's cup. "Please, Dolores, and maybe some of those blueberry muffins if you've got them." As Dolores moved away, Thomas studied his son's profile. Bobby's hands shook slightly as he raised his coffee cup, and there was something haunted in his expression that Thomas had never seen before. "You look like hell," Thomas said finally. Bobby's laugh was bitter. "Thanks for the pep talk. Want to tell me what's eating at you? Because abandoning your wife and newborn daughter to handle business isn't like you. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." Bobby's voice carried an edge that made Thomas straighten in his seat. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and placed the Romano's receipt on the table between them. Bobby's face went white. "Business dinner?" Thomas's tone remained carefully controlled. Bobby stared at the receipt without picking it up. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me. Because what I think is that while Sarah was in the hospital with your daughter, you were whining and dining someone else at the fanciest restaurant in town." "Dad, you don't understand." "Try me." Bobby's hands clenched around his coffee cup. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Finally, Bobby looked up, and Thomas saw something that chilled him more than anger ever could. Resignation. "I ran into Jenny Walsh last week," Bobby said quietly. Thomas felt his blood pressure spike. Jenny Walsh, Bobby's high school sweetheart, the girl who'd broken his heart when she left for college in Nashville. The girl Bobby had spent 2 years getting over before he met Sarah. And we talked, that's all. Just talked. But Dolores, refilling nearby tables, had been listening with the practiced ease of someone who'd heard every secret Millbrook had to offer. She paused at their booth, her expression troubled. "Bobby, honey, I don't mean to intrude, but I seen you with that Walsh girl more than once lately. Yesterday at Romano's, last Tuesday at the park, Sunday afternoon at the Dairy Queen." Her voice carried the gentle reproach of someone who'd known him since childhood. That poor little Sarah just had herself a baby. Bobby's face flushed red. He stood abruptly, throwing a $20 bill onto the table. "Dad, there are things about my marriage you don't understand. Things about me you don't understand." "Then help me understand," Thomas said, rising as well. But Bobby was already walking away, leaving Thomas staring after him with a growing sense of dread and the terrible certainty that his family was about to fracture in ways that might never heal. The third evening alone stretched before Sarah like an endless corridor. Emma fussed in her arms, tiny fists waving as Sarah tried to coax her to take the bottle. The kitchen felt too quiet, too empty, despite the soft sounds of the baby's protests. Bobby's chair at their small dining table remained pushed in, untouched since breakfast 3 days ago. "Come on, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, adjusting Emma's position. "Daddy's just working late again." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her stomach. She'd called Mitchell's Hardware twice that afternoon, and both times the owner, Mr. Peterson, had told her Bobby left around 3 o'clock. It was now past 8, and Bobby's truck wasn't in the driveway. Emma finally settled into feeding, her small body relaxing against Sarah's chest. In the sudden quiet, Sarah noticed things she'd been too exhausted to see before. A coffee cup in the sink that wasn't hers, lipstick stains around the rim in a shade she'd never worn. Her hands trembled as she lifted it to the light, examining the deep red color that looked nothing like her usual pink gloss. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing Emma, Sarah walked into the living room and began straightening cushions on their second-hand couch. Her fingers found something hard lodged between the armrest and seat back. She pulled it free, a small silver earring, dangling with tiny crystals that caught the lamplight. It was elegant, expensive-looking, and definitely not hers. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd never owned jewelry like this, had never been able to afford anything so delicate and beautiful. The earring felt cold against her palm, a tangible piece of evidence that someone else had been in her home, sitting on her couch, close enough to lose jewelry in the cushions. The sound of Bobby's truck in the driveway made her jump. She quickly pocketed the earring and settled back into the rocking chair, arranging Emma and herself to look natural, domestic, unsuspecting. But her heart hammered against her ribs as she heard his key in the lock. Bobby entered quietly, assuming she might be asleep. He moved through the house like a stranger, careful not to let his footsteps creak on the familiar floorboards. When he appeared in the doorway of the living room, Sarah caught a whiff of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes, something floral and sophisticated that made her stomach clench. "You're up late," he said, not meeting her eyes. Emma was hungry. Sarah kept her voice level, though every word felt like swallowing glass. "Where were you?" "Hardware store. Inventory." The lie came too quickly, too smoothly, as if he'd practiced it during the drive home. "I called the store. Mr. Peterson said you left hours ago." Bobby's jaw tightened. He moved to the window, staring out at their small backyard, where Sarah had planted tomatoes last spring, back when their biggest worry was whether they'd have enough vegetables for canning season. "Maybe we rushed into this whole marriage and baby thing," he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. Emma stirred in her arms, sensing her mother's distress, and let out a small cry that seemed to echo in the suddenly cavernous room. "What did you say?" Bobby turned, and for the first time in weeks, he looked directly at her. His eyes held something she'd never seen before. Regret. Not the temporary regret of a bad decision, but the deep, soul-crushing regret of a man who'd realized he'd chosen the wrong life entirely. "I said maybe we moved too fast." Sarah stared at him. This man she'd married, this father of her child, and realized she was looking at a stranger. The Bobby she'd fallen in love with would never have come home smelling like another woman's perfume, would never have stood in their living room suggesting their marriage, their daughter, had been a mistake. Her first solo trip to Miller's grocery store felt like a monumental expedition. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier, blissfully unaware of the courage it took for Sarah to leave the house, navigate the parking lot, and walk through those familiar sliding doors as a new mother, alone. The store hummed with its usual activity, elderly customers comparing prices on canned goods, mothers with school-aged children grabbing snacks and milk. Sarah had shopped here since moving to Millbrook, knew most of the employees by name, had always felt welcome in the bright, organized aisles. Today felt different. Tammy Rodriguez, the young woman who usually chatted cheerfully while scanning groceries, barely made eye contact as Sarah approached with her cart. Her smile seemed forced, uncomfortable, and she focused intently on each item as if she'd never seen baby formula before. "How's the little one doing?" Tammy asked, but her voice carried an odd note, as if she were asking because she felt she should, not because she wanted to know. "She's perfect," Sarah replied, adjusting Emma's blanket. "Growing fast." Tammy nodded, scanning items with unusual speed. In the cereal aisle, Sarah paused to compare prices on oatmeal. Emma's carrier balanced carefully in the cart's child seat. Two women stood near the granola bars, their voices lowered but not enough to prevent Sarah from catching fragments of their conversation. "Saw his truck there again last night. Poor thing doesn't even know. That Walsh girl always was trouble. Sarah's hand stilled on a box of instant oatmeal. The women continued talking, unaware she was listening. Bobby Mitchell's always been weak when it comes to pretty faces, the first woman said. Sarah recognized the voice, Mrs. Henderson from the diner. Remember how he carried on over Jenny in high school? Thought he'd outgrown that foolishness. Some men never do, replied the second voice, especially when the old flame comes back to town looking for excitement. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to turn around to confront them, to demand they explain what they meant. Instead, she found herself frozen between the cornflakes and granola, clutching Emma's carrier like a lifeline. A jar of baby food slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crash that echoed through the store. Glass scattered across the linoleum, and pureed carrots splashed onto her shoes. The conversation behind her stopped abruptly. Tammy appeared with a mop and dustpan, her expression genuinely sympathetic for the first time that day. As she knelt to clean up the mess, she glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then whispered urgently, "Honey, you need to know, Bobby's been parking outside Jenny's place every evening this week. My cousin lives in the same complex. She's seen him there past midnight more than once." Sarah's world shifted again, the grocery store suddenly too bright, too loud, too full of people who knew her business better than she did. Emma began to fuss, sensing her mother's distress, and Sarah realized she was gripping the cart handle so tightly her knuckles had gone white. That night, Sarah sat in the living room with all the lights on, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. She'd positioned herself facing the front window, watching for Bobby's headlights to sweep across the wall. The digital clock on the cable box glowed 1:47 a.m. when she finally heard his truck in the driveway. She didn't pretend to be asleep this time. When Bobby opened the front door, she was waiting, sitting upright in the rocking chair Thomas had bought for her, Emma cradled against her chest like armor against whatever truth was about to destroy her world. Bobby stopped short when he saw her, his hand still on the doorknob. In the harsh overhead light, he looked older, worn down by secrets and lies. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair mussed, and that same floral perfume clung to him like an accusation. "We need to talk," Sarah said. Bobby closed the door but didn't move further into the room. "Sarah, it's late. Can't this wait until morning? I found this." She pulled the earring from her pocket, holding it up so it caught the light. "Between the couch cushions, it's not mine." Bobby's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, resignation, and finally something that might have been relief. He sat heavily on the couch, in the exact spot where the earring had been hidden. "How long?" Sarah asked. "How long what?" "Don't lie to me anymore, Bobby. Please, I can't take any more lies." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd once found endearing and now recognized as a tell, something he did when caught in deception. "Jenny came back to town 6 weeks ago," he said finally. "She called me, said she wanted to see how I was doing, catch up on old times." 6 weeks ago? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I was 7 months pregnant. It wasn't supposed to happen, Sarah. I swear to you, it wasn't planned." "What wasn't planned?" Bobby looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the truth before he spoke it. "Jenny understands me in ways you never could. We have history, Sarah. We have connection." The words hit her like physical blows. Emma stirred in her arms, and Sarah realized she was shaking, her whole body trembling, with the force of holding herself together. "I never meant for you to get pregnant so soon after the wedding," Bobby continued, his voice gaining strength as if confession was liberating him. "We barely knew each other. We rushed into everything because it felt like the right thing to do. But Sarah, I don't think I ever really loved you the way you deserved." Sarah stared at him, this man who had promised to love her in sickness and health, who had held her hand through morning sickness and labor pains, who had helped paint the nursery and assemble the crib where their daughter now slept every night. Bobby stood and walked toward the hallway, toward their bedroom where his clothes hung in the closet next to hers. When he returned, he carried a duffel bag packed with enough items for more than just a night away. "I'll send money for Emma," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. Just abandoning your family." He paused at the front door, his hand on the knob, and for a moment Sarah thought he might change his mind, might remember who they used to be together. Instead, he turned back one last time and said, "Jenny and I are going to Nashville to start over. We're leaving this weekend." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything Sarah had believed about love, marriage, and the man she'd trusted with her heart. The next morning, Thomas Mitchell arrived at his hardware store to find Bobby already inside, methodically checking inventory as if the previous night's confrontation with Sarah had never happened. The familiar smell of sawdust and metal polish filled the air, but today it couldn't mask the tension that crackled between father and son like electricity before a storm. "You're here early," Thomas said, hanging his jacket on the hook behind the counter. Bobby didn't look up from his clipboard. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be productive." Thomas studied his son's profile, noting the stubble, the wrinkled clothes, the way Bobby's hands trembled slightly as he wrote, "Where did you spend the night? Does it matter?" "It matters to me. It matters to Sarah. It matters to your daughter." Bobby finally looked up, and Thomas saw something that chilled him more than anger ever could: complete indifference. "Sarah will be fine. She's got family support, friends in town. Emma will grow up better without me around to mess things up." "That's not your decision to make alone." "Actually, it is." Bobby set down the clipboard and faced his father directly. "Jenny got a job offer in Nashville. Good pay, fresh start. We're leaving together this weekend." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Thomas felt his chest tighten, not from his heart condition, but from the realization that the son he'd raised, the boy he'd taught to fish and drive and be a man of honor, was standing before him as a stranger. "And Emma, your daughter, I'll send money, child support. Sarah won't want for anything." "Money?" Thomas's voice was deadly quiet. "You think money replaces a father?" Bobby's jaw tightened. "I think honesty is better than living a lie. I never should have married Sarah. I was on the rebound from Jenny, and Sarah was sweet and available and pregnant, happened faster than either of us expected." Thomas walked to the old wooden desk where he kept the store's important papers. He pulled out a manila folder containing documents he'd planned to present to Bobby on Emma's first birthday. The deed transfer papers that would make Bobby a full partner in Mitchell's hardware, and the will amendments that included college funds and inheritance provisions for Emma. Without a word, Thomas tore the deed transfer in half, then quarters, then eighths. The pieces fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. He opened the will to the pages concerning Bobby's inheritance, and drew thick black lines through every mention of his son's name. "What are you doing?" Bobby asked, his voice cracking slightly. "A man who abandons his child abandons everything I taught him," Thomas said calmly. "A man who breaks his vows, who lies to his wife, who chooses selfishness over responsibility, isn't worthy of the Mitchell name." He walked to the store's safe and removed Bobby's name from the signatory cards, then changed the locks on the office door while Bobby watched in stunned silence. "Dad, you can't." "I can, and I am. You want to start over? Fine. Start over with nothing, just like the man you've chosen to become." Thomas left Bobby standing among the scattered pieces of his inheritance and drove straight to Maple Street. He found Sarah on the front porch, Emma sleeping in her carrier beside the rocking chair. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, but she managed a weak smile when she saw him. "I brought groceries," Thomas said, though his arms were empty. "They're in the car." Sarah nodded, not seeming to notice his lie. "Thomas, I'm sorry. I know he's your son, and this must be—" "Stop." Thomas sat heavily in the chair beside her, suddenly feeling every one of his 64 years. "I failed as a father if I raised a son who could do this to his family." Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears she'd been holding back for days spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands. "I feel so stupid. Everyone in town knew about Jenny before I did. I keep thinking about signs I missed, things I should have seen." Thomas reached over and gently patted her shoulder, unsure how to comfort her, but knowing he had to try. "You're not stupid, sweetheart. You're trusting. You believed in your marriage vows because you're the kind of person who keeps promises." Emma stirred at the sound of voices, opening her eyes and looking around with the unfocused gaze of a newborn. Thomas felt his heart clench as he looked at her perfect little face, knowing she would grow up with questions about her father that he couldn't answer without destroying what little innocence remained in their broken family. "You can stay in this house as long as you need," Thomas said suddenly. "I'll handle the mortgage, utilities, whatever you need. Emma deserves stability, and you deserve time to figure out what comes next." A car door slammed in the street, and both Thomas and Sarah looked up to see a familiar figure walking toward the house with determined strides. Jenny Walsh looked exactly as Thomas remembered from Bobby's high school graduation. Blonde hair perfectly styled, clothes that cost more than most people in Millbrook spent on monthly groceries, and an expression of absolute entitlement. "I need to talk to Sarah," Jenny announced as she reached the porch steps, not bothering with pleasantries or acknowledgement of Thomas's presence. "I don't think that's a good idea," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "It's okay," Sarah said quietly, surprising him. "Let her say whatever she came to say." Jenny walked onto the porch uninvited, her high heels clicking against the wooden boards. But instead of the confrontational attitude Thomas expected, her face was streaked with tears, and her hands shook as she twisted a tissue between her fingers. "I need you to know," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bobby told me your marriage was over. He said you two were getting divorced anyway, that you were just staying together until after the baby was born." Sarah's face went pale. "That's not true." "I know that now," Jenny's voice broke. "Seeing you here, with Emma, in your home, our home, I realize Bobby lied to both of us. He's been telling me for months that he was going to leave you, that your marriage was just a mistake he was trying to fix." Thomas watched this revelation unfold, seeing how each word landed on Sarah like a physical blow. Emma began to fuss, sensing the tension in the air, and Sarah automatically began rocking her carrier with one foot, while her world collapsed around her for the second time in 24 hours. "There's something else," Jenny continued, her tears flowing freely now. "Bobby owes money, gambling money, a lot of it. He told me Nashville was our chance for a fresh start together, but yesterday I overheard a phone call. He's not running to something, Sarah. He's running away from something, and he's using me to do it." Sarah stared at Jenny, processing this information. The man she'd married, the father of her child, wasn't just unfaithful. He was also in serious financial trouble, using both women as escape routes from problems he'd created himself. "How much money?" Thomas asked quietly. Jenny wiped her nose with the twisted tissue. "From what I could hear, at least $20,000. Maybe more. He cleaned out his savings account yesterday and asked me to sell my car so we'd have cash for the trip." Thomas felt anger building in his chest, not just at Bobby's betrayal of his family, but at his cowardice in the face of his mistakes. Running away solved nothing and left everyone else to deal with the consequences of his choices. The drive to Nashville felt like traveling through a nightmare. Thomas had called in favors to track down Bobby's location, and Sarah had insisted on coming, despite his protests that she should stay home with Emma. She sat in the passenger seat of his Buick, Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat, while they followed Interstate 40 toward a confrontation none of them were prepared for. They found Bobby at the Nashville Greyhound station, sitting on a plastic bench with two duffel bags and a haunted expression. He looked up as they approached, and Sarah saw genuine fear in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. "Sarah? Dad? What are you doing here?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built a business and raised a family through decades of hard decisions. "We're here to give you one last chance to be the man I thought I raised." Bobby's laugh was bitter and hollow. "The man you raised? Dad, you raised me to be responsible, honorable, trustworthy. I'm none of those things. I'm doing everyone a favor by leaving." Sarah stepped closer, Emma's carrier balanced carefully in her arms. People moved around them in the busy terminal. Families reuniting, travelers departing, normal people living normal lives while her world fractured beyond repair. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "I do deserve better than someone who lies to his pregnant wife, who gambles away their savings, who chooses to run instead of facing his problems." Bobby looked up at her, perhaps expecting anger or pleading, but finding something else entirely in her eyes: clarity. And Emma deserves better too, Sarah continued. She deserves a father who shows up, who keeps promises, who teaches her that love means staying even when things get difficult. Sarah, No. Sarah's voice grew stronger. You don't get to explain this away or make excuses. You made your choice. Now we get to make ours. She turned to Thomas, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. We should go home. Emma needs her afternoon feeding, and we have a life to build. As they walked away from Bobby, leaving him alone on that plastic bench with his duffel bags and his bad decisions, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The uncertainty was over. The waiting for him to choose his family was finished. Now she could focus on the people who actually wanted to be part of Emma's life. Back in Millbrook, they sat on Sarah's front porch as the sun began to set over the familiar streets. Thomas pushed Emma's stroller gently back and forth, while Sarah finally allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't include Bobby's lies and empty promises. I'm not angry anymore, Sarah said, surprising herself with the truth of it. I'm sad for him, actually. He's throwing away something real for something that was never going to last. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she knew. I was too hard on him growing up, always pushing him to be perfect, never allowing for mistakes. Maybe if I'd been different. You can't blame yourself for his choices, Sarah said gently. Emma and I are lucky to have you. A car approached from the direction of town, moving slowly as if the driver was unsure of the destination. It stopped in front of the house and Jenny Walsh stepped out. But this time she looked different, tired, defeated, and strangely vulnerable, without her usual armor of expensive clothes and perfect makeup. She walked to the porch carrying a small suitcase, her movements hesitant and uncertain. I know you have no reason to trust me or want to see me, she said to Sarah, but I wanted you to know, Bobby left me stranded at that bus station. When those men came looking for their money, he ran. Just ran and left me there alone. Sarah felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this woman who had been used just as thoroughly as she had been, perhaps more so. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? Jenny shook her head. They weren't interested in me. They just wanted Bobby to know they'd find him eventually. She paused, looking at Emma sleeping peacefully in her stroller. I came back to Millbrook because I didn't have anywhere else to go, but also because I owed you an apology, a real one. Thomas surprised everyone by standing and bringing a third chair from inside the house. Sit down, Jenny. You look exhausted. As Jenny settled into the chair, Emma reached out from her stroller and grasped Jenny's finger with her tiny hand. The simple gesture seemed to break something loose in Jenny's chest, and she began to cry, not the manipulative tears of earlier, but genuine sorrow for the pain she'd helped cause. I was so jealous of what you had, Jenny whispered to Sarah. A home, a family, someone who chose you. I convinced myself that Bobby belonged with me because we had history, but watching you with Emma, I see what I helped destroy. Thomas leaned back in his chair, observing these two women who had both been deceived by his son, both left to pick up pieces of lives that had been shattered by one man's selfishness. In Emma's innocent gesture of reaching for Jenny's finger, he saw something his son had been incapable of understanding, the capacity for forgiveness and connection that transcends past hurts. This little girl's going to have more family than she knows what to do with, Thomas said quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Thomas, then at Jenny, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled genuinely. The pain of Bobby's betrayal would take time to heal, but sitting on this porch with people who had chosen to stay, who had chosen to face difficult truths and work toward something better, she finally saw a path forward. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Emma gurgled contentedly in her stroller, surrounded by the kind of love that doesn't abandon, doesn't lie, and doesn't run away when life gets complicated. It was, Sarah realized, exactly the kind of love her daughter deserved, to grow up knowing was possible.